final place of rest for today. And what we're going to be looking at is the subject of is God good, where I want to tackle particularly the question of how things seem in the Old Testament. I'm sure those of us who are Christians would say, you know, if you have to answer the question, is God good, you know the correct answer is yes. But then you also know that there are bits in the Old Testament, particularly in the Bible, but particularly in the Old Testament, which really puzzle us, and we struggle because we think, okay, God's good, but where does that thing fit with his goodness? And I want to tackle two things tonight, and we can maybe go to some other things within the questions. And I always don't particularly like the phrase questions and answers, because it implies that all the questions get answered. You know, so certainly a question time we'll have at the end, and there may be some answers to the questions as well. And I want to look at two tough questions that come up about the Old Testament. One is the destruction of the Canaanites, when God commands Joshua and the people of God to go in and destroy the 7 nations that are in the land of Canaan. And the other question is the question of slavery. A lot of people say, well, doesn't the Old Testament basically allow and support slavery? So let's try and look at those two questions in the Old Testament. There may be other questions you want to raise if you want to make sure you can see a screen. The screen may be far better to look at than me. Anyway, let's start with the way secularists tell the story, because secularists tell a story, and remember, telling stories is a way of persuasion. So in fact, the fact that they have a story to tell makes them seem more plausible. And they tell a story of religion and violence going together, whether it's crusades, European wars of religion, or witch hunts. All the time they say religion and violence go together. Then, of course, you get the tragedy of 9/11, religion and violence going together, and you put it into one big story and you say religion and violence go together. Religion is harmful, you're Christian, you're religious, that's a harmful thing. Now, that's a sort of story that is being told nowadays. Religion causes violence, they say, and it is partly true. There are religious belief systems, like the religious belief system of Al-Qaeda, which does cause violence. There's no doubt about it. But to say that religion in itself causes violence is a little bit of a generalisation. You might as well say politics, or leadership, or thinking cause violence. Because after all, we can give examples where each one of those leads to violence. And so we might say, well, if we just got rid of thinking, there would be no violence. Well, we can see that thinking can be a good thing and a bad thing. If you think violent thoughts, that's bad. Leadership. I mean, if you had no leadership, you wouldn't have the terrible despots who do all the violent things in the world. But of course, we know leadership can also be used for good, like science. I mean, would anyone say science causes violence? Because we can think of all the weapons of mass destruction that wouldn't exist if it weren't for science. But people know, of course, that science can be used for good ends, like fighting cancer, and bad ends as well. So people know it's a neutral thing, and yet somehow, when it comes to religion, whatever that is, well, it's something that people like to say Christians are religious, even if Christians like to say they're not religious. Christians are generally thought of as being religious, and people have this idea that religions generally cause violence. And so that isn't a very good starting point. Now, we could reply, of course, that you take a couple of figures like Chairman Mao and Stalin, and between them they killed more people than were killed during all of the wars of religion in all of history, and they are two atheists. They didn't believe in God, and so we might want to say, actually, if you want to say religion causes violence, we can play that back on you, and we can say, well, not believing in God causes violence. Now, of course, someone could say, but actually, there are people who don't believe in God who aren't very violent, and that is true. So let's go on to the biblical specifics. That's just preamble. Doesn't God command the Israelites to destroy the Canaanites? How can a God of love command the destruction of 7 nations? What about the poor, innocent children? Isn't that genocide? And I think this is the point to make, if your God could tell them to kill people then, might he tell you to kill people now? And then that would be just the same as the suicide bombers. And we know that's wrong. So those are the sorts of objections that we can hear, and I hope you can feel a certain force to them. So that's what we're going to try and tackle head on. So the way atheists, people who don't believe in God, secularists nowadays are often seeing things is that the command you have in the Old Testament that the Israelites should destroy the Canaanites is equated with two very bad things. One is religious terrorism, the sort of Al-Qaeda thing. The other thing is it's equated with genocide, the sort of thing that went on in Rwanda. And so those two terrible things all exist, it is said, together in the Old Testament command, all of which would show, of course, that the Old Testament command was not a good thing. How are we going to answer this? Well, I've got a number of ways to deal with this question. By the way, I'm not saying I'm going to answer this question. Not all questions need to be answered. By the way, lots of why did God questions? Why did God questions often can't be answered? Because after all, if you've got a being whose thoughts are higher than your thoughts, why should we always be able to follow his reasons? So why did God question? We shouldn't assume that we should be able to answer. But I'm nevertheless going to try and make some attempt at providing an answer, something that would be a bit satisfying. The first thing I want to establish, though, is that actually when we think about what we feel is right and wrong, and what atheists say they feel is right and wrong, that those feelings about what's right and wrong are often governed by assumptions about the universe. I mean, to make a fairly obvious point, you've heard of Tom and Jerry. Tom and Jerry exist in a physical universe which is rather different from our own. Because what can happen is Tom the cat can get squashed or stretched or whatever, and then 2 minutes later he will be fine. That means that as Tom and Jerry play their tricks on each other, you know that they're never fatal. I mean, they never get killed. That just doesn't happen. That cannot happen in the Tom and Jerry universe. In other words, different physical laws apply, which might be why some of us are prepared to let our children watch Tom and Jerry. Because we actually realise that the children are clever enough to realise that different physical laws apply in the Tom and Jerry universe, that they can't do all these things that Tom and Jerry do to each other at home. They're clever enough to realise that different things apply. And that's a very important point. You see, you can take another case where different physical laws apply. You know the story of the magician's nephew, and he... No, that's Narnia. I mean the Sorcerer's Apprentice, thank you. Sorcerer's Apprentice. And you know what goes on there, that every time he knocks down one of those brooms, just another one comes up. Now imagine, I mean, one of the reasons why stabbing someone is so bad is, one, it causes pain, and two, it's likely to terminate their existence or terminate their life. That's what makes stabbing so bad. If you stabbed someone and it gave them a whole load of pleasure, and, you know, made them grow to twice their size, or made them live twice as long, stabbing would be rather different. There probably wouldn't be the same sort of laws against stabbing people, and, you know, see what I mean? So your assumptions about the physical universe actually govern, you know, have an effect on what we view as moral or not. Now I know atheists actually have a problem defining morality at all, because if they can't appeal to a higher being, what's the ground for saying anything's right and wrong? But let's allow them to have some sense of morality. I want to say it's governed by their assumptions about the universe. And this is the key thing. Atheists and Christians believe fundamentally different things about the universe. You see, an atheist believes that the physical universe is all that there is. They believe that, you know, death is the end. They don't believe in miracles, and so on. That actually makes quite a difference. Because then when we go to the biblical story in Genesis chapter 22, where Abraham is commanded by God to offer up his son, as an atheist reads that, they read it in one particular way. They might well read it and say, well, here we have, you know, someone doing violence because of their religious belief. That's what they think. Well, remember, a key part of the story is that he doesn't actually stab his son. That's actually a very important part of the story. But the other part of it is, what's going on in Abraham's mind? In the story, it's actually a miraculous story, because Abraham had Isaac at a time of life that was quite miraculous. And God had already shown himself to be able to do amazing things in Abraham's life. And God had already shown himself to be faithful to his promises. And God had promised to Abraham before this point that through Isaac, Abraham would have many more descendants. Which means that Abraham knows, even as he lifts the knife, that whatever he does, Isaac is going to have a continued existence and have more children. Now that's in the text of Genesis. Hebrews, by the way, picks up on this, saying that, Abraham reckoned that God was able to raise him from the dead. But the point is, Abraham lived in a world which had different physical laws from the universe that atheists think they're in. And that's why, under very exceptional circumstances, sometimes different things can be right and wrong. That doesn't mean, of course, that we have free rein to go and carry knives and so on. Now, people do agree that exceptional circumstances can call for exceptional actions. Let me give, again, it's a painful example. At 9/11, there were executive orders given to scrambled jets telling them that they might be authorised to shoot down passenger planes that were going towards very populated areas if it was thought that more destruction, more loss of life would result from those passenger planes going over those populous areas, and that those passenger planes were being used as missiles. Now, we might debate the rights and wrongs of that in an ethics class. I imagine, those orders never had to be carried out. And I imagine that we might well, those who were relatives of those on any plane shot down would have felt one way about it, but then any president or if people had not carried out the orders and more life had been lost, there would have been many questions raised as well. So it's a very, very exceptional circumstance, one that one could talk about and debate and maybe not agree about. But at least we can say it's not obviously wrong to everyone in the room that those executive orders would have been wrong. But in the case of Abraham and what God commanded, we're not talking about an American president. Now, we could debate what the American president's powers should be, whether certain presidents go over their powers, and whether executive orders of that kind would have been going over the powers given to a president. We could debate that, and I imagine that people would have different opinions on that. But what we can say is, when we're talking about God, we're talking about the one who has made all things, who has given all life. Therefore, the question of whether someone is a duly constituted authority is actually rather different. I mean, certainly no one without due authority can go and do anything in those sorts of circumstances. But with due authorization, perhaps one might. But with God's authorization, of course, God is far above us, and he's able to do these things. Now that might sound rather scary, but I want to build some more things into it. Another thing that can change what can be right and wrong is what we know, like omniscience. God knows all things. How much would that change? Well, actually, what you know affects what's moral. I mean, let's give an example. If I have a young child, a 1 or 2 year old child, and I know that they like to be bounced up and down, and so I throw them up in the air, and they look, they giggle, and I catch them, and so on. Was that a moral or immoral act? Well, I think it was perfectly moral, perfectly fine. Is it okay for me to throw them up in the air if I don't know I can catch them? Actually, it completely changes the morality of the action, doesn't it? So what we know about what our action will cause affects the morality of an action. If we happen to know that there was nothing coming round a corner, it might be okay to go round that corner, but, and overtake round a corner. But the reason why generally overtaking round corners is not a good idea is because we don't know what's coming round the corner. So if you're in a situation where there's a planned road race and they close the road, then going round that corner on the other side of the road and so on, overtaking, that can be fine because of what you know. On the other hand, in a normal circumstances, it's not okay. So what you know affects what can be right and wrong. So, think about this. If God knows all things, God knows all of the effects that will happen through anything that he asks people to do, that can make a difference. or if you know that you're acting on the basis of information given to you by someone omniscient. Again, that can make a difference. So I want to say that does make a difference. So I want to make this claim about the Old Testament. Much of the Old Testament, when we read it, is actually just that sort of exceptional circumstance. And that if we read it, and we see all of the things that are going on, we will realise that yes, it is the same world we're living in, but it also is dealing with ethically exceptional circumstances. Now, you know what happens in ethically exceptional circumstances? They're the sort of things that people talk about in ethics classes. I mean, you know, the classic, you're in a bus going down a hill and the brakes fail. You know, then you're going to go off a cliff unless you actually turn the bus to where you know there's one child who will be knocked over and then all the people on your bus will be saved. And, you know, people have debates about this. It's not, I mean, it's not necessarily very fruitful because, let's face it, we're very rarely in those sorts of circumstances. It's not, you know, ethical classes like that are not necessarily very practical. But the point is this. They can raise questions about what might or might not be allowed in exceptional circumstances. I want to say what's going on in the Old Testament is exceptional, and there are many, many things about the story that tell you it's exceptional. So the idea that normal Bible readers don't notice that we read the Old Testament and think, oh, that means I can go out and kill a Canaanite, just isn't really valid. Actually, there are loads of reasons that we notice it's a very different story. And a big safeguard in all of this is the character of God. I'm not just giving you a presentation of, you know, exceptional circumstances. What I'm saying is underwriting the whole of the Old Testament is God's goodness. God, we're dealing with exceptional physical laws sometimes. We're dealing with God's exceptional level of knowledge, his omniscience, but also his good character, and that's very important. And it's the same God, of course, who is revealed at the cross. That, again, is the way I read the Old Testament. I read the Old Testament having read the New. And I read that this is not a God who's distant from our world, distant from our circumstances. He, in fact, is very touched by us and by the suffering. So what can we say about the character of God? God reveals himself as merciful. The Old Testament gives a record of his gracious acts. God's got a proven character and humans can trust him. Now, what often skeptics do, and I think this is unfair, when they attack the Old Testament, they launch two attacks on it at the same time, like two missiles. One attack is the Old Testament's fairy stories, it didn't really happen. The second attack is it's really, really unfair. Now I want to say that's not fair to launch those two attacks at the same time. Because the danger is this. If you launch those two attacks at the same time, you're not actually attacking the Old Testament as it's written, as the story is, you're attacking your version of what happened. You see, not the actual story. And actually, whether or not the story is a true story, whether it happened, isn't particularly relevant for whether something, judging how moral a story is. I mean, we can read a book of fiction, can't we? And judge whether it's a moral story or not. So what I want to do is just say, let's take the Old Testament as it stands. Let's deal with that as a story and judge how moral it is. This is how one skeptic comes up with it. This is how Richard Dawkins describes the Old Testament. The ethnic cleansing, notice the phrase, begun in the time of Moses, is brought to bloody fruition in the book of Joshua, a text remarkable for the bloodthirsty massacres it records and the xenophobic relish with which it does so. Yet again, theologians will protest it didn't happen. Indeed, it didn't happen, but that's not the point. The point is that whether true or not, the Bible is held up to us as a source of our morality. Now, I want to say that actually, when we're looking at a story, we can bracket out the question of whether or not it happened. What we're looking at is how moral it is as a story. Again, Dawkins, the Bible story of Joshua's destruction of Jericho and the invasion of the Promised Land in general is morally indistinguishable, can't be no difference from Hitler's invasion of Poland or Saddam Hussein's massacre of the Kurds and the Marsh Arabs. That's what Richard Dawkins, the British atheist, has to say. But I fear that when Dawkins reads the story, he's got a rather different version from what's actually in the Bible. Because when he tells the story, God, because he doesn't believe in God, doesn't actually speak to people. God doesn't actually perform miracles, there isn't really a massive exodus, and characters in the story are judged as if God hadn't actually spoken to them. So in other words, he's not critiquing what the Bible says, he's critiquing a watered down version of the miraculous Bible story, a version which actually is less miraculous. Do you see? So, this is how the Bible story goes. The real Bible story as it is in the Bible. To begin the Bible story, we have to begin at the beginning of the Bible. And in the beginning of the Bible, we read that God gave everyone life. Now, he might say, I don't believe in God. That's not relevant. God is a character in the narrative. So even if you're an atheist, if you're going to look at the story, you have to do it. You know, there's no you saying, I'm looking at whether Tom and Jerry are moral, and I say, well, I don't believe in Tom. You know, we're looking at the story. Or if you're judging the story, the Odyssey, Homer's Odyssey, you say, well, I don't believe in Athena. But she's a character in the narrative, so if I'm going to look at it and judge whether it's a story which leads you in a right direction or a wrong direction, I need to treat her as real. So the point is, this is the God in the story. The God in the story gave everyone life and doesn't think violence is good because at the very beginning there was none. It's a perfect world of harmony. Then we can look at the end of the story, chronologically in the Bible. You know, the wolf flies down with a lamb and everything's peaceful. So the beginning and end of the story give you some pretty big clues as to the values which are advocated, which are promoted in the story, don't they? They tell you what is going on. And so they may not take up chapter after chapter in terms of length, but in terms of significance and their placing, it's pretty key. Then we need to know about the Canaanites in the story. Actually, it says that they were punished for their wickedness, not for their race. So the idea that this is some sort of genocide, you know, on the basis of race isn't valid. How can we show that? Well, Rahab was a Canaanite, but Rahab was a Canaanite who decided that she had been presented with enough evidence that she would switch her allegiance to God. In other words, there was enough evidence out there for people to switch their allegiance to God. She did so, and as a result was spared. On the other hand, there is an opposite of Rahab. Have you ever heard of Achan? Achan was the Israelite who became a Canaanite. Rahab was like a Canaanite who became more like an Israelite in terms of real allegiance. You see, so it's not a matter of race. When Israel, in fact, in the Old Testament commits the same sins as the Canaanites, they get judged in the same way. Canaanites are bad, God sends in the Israelites to drive them out. Israelites are bad, God sends in the Assyrians to drive them out. People of Judah are bad, God sends in the Babylonians to drive them out. You see, it's consistent. Whenever people in that holy land are bad, God sends another nation to judge them. In fact, it's also in the book of Judges, the same sort of thing. So it's not that it's, oh, God favours one nation and not another nation in terms of justice. Oh yes, God does favour and show special favours to a nation, but not in terms of his justice. What's more, according to the narrative, the people in the land of Canaan knew what God could do and chose to resist. You see, this is something that Rahab comes out with. Rahab says to the spies, the two spies who come to her house, she says, we've heard all of the amazing things that God's done and how he dried up the waters of the Red Sea and all such things, and our hearts have melted. The hearts of the people in the whole land have melted. And yet, despite the fact that they knew what God could do, the people of Jericho decided to shut their gates and to resist. So the idea that they had no warning is just not valid. We could also say that the Canaanites in the Bible, and it seems also archaeologically, were involved in child sacrifice. This is what it says in Deuteronomy. Every abominable thing the Lord hates, they've done for their gods. They even burn their sons and their daughters in the fire to their gods. Then we need to think about the Israelites. You know, some people are worried that if we read the Old Testament, we're going to start doing everything that anyone in the Old Testament did. Actually, I don't think that is a reason to be worried about. I mean, just because I read the Old Testament and God created the world doesn't mean I'm going to think I can create the world. You know, you realise there's a difference. And it's the same with Israel. Israel had a unique position as God's judicial representative, being doing his judgment on other people, we know that there is no nation on earth at the moment that has that same position. And what's more, when the story takes place, the judgment and God's work is accompanied by the greatest display of miracles recorded in the whole Old Testament in terms of visible display. I mean, when you have more visible miracles than at the Exodus and the plagues in Egypt and so on. So in other words, there are so many miracles, and God speaking from the top of a mountain to 603,550 men at Sinai and so on, that there can be no question in anyone's mind that God is actually commanding, that God is actually speaking. Do you see? Now that makes it, of course, very, very different from anyone who, for instance, gets a little religious idea in their mind that God's telling them to kill someone. That can't be put in the same category as any situation in which a nation has God appear to them in a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire during 40 years, leads them, do miracles, feed them with manna from heaven and so on, and then tells them to do something. Do you see what I mean? It's in a completely different category. Those subjective feelings that I ought to do something, they carry no weight. Whereas in this case, the characters in the narrative really have God appear to them in a major way. Which means that in the story, those people couldn't reasonably doubt that God was actually speaking to them. You see, that they couldn't do that. Then we look at the question of God's omniscience. What we can say is, when they went in, well, didn't that put an end to Canaanite child sacrifice? And that's where, if God knows what an action might cause, then that might be a ground, a morally sufficient reason for him to allow something that otherwise wouldn't be allowed. You see, if he had just let the Canaanites go on generation after generation, killing their children, sacrificing their children, how much suffering would that have caused over so many generations? God might well do his sums, but I think he can count. You know, and he might well say, actually, what I am commanding will cause less suffering. Now, I know people might be rather worried about that, because that could cause us, if we think, well, we can make those calculations to do bad things. But we can't make those calculations, because guess what? We're not omniscient. So, I think that is a legitimate argument we could say that God might have reasons. Now, that's not a reason that's given in the Bible. There are many things that are not explained in the Bible. I'm just trying to say, God can have reasons that we could never have ourselves, because we are not God. God is God, and that's very different. So we need to think more about the character of God. How is God portrayed in the Old Testament? Well, one thing we can say is God is portrayed in the Old Testament as having a greater tendency to mercy than towards anger. He is slow to anger, but he is abounding in mercy, and that is presented again and again. That means if you do see him recorded as being angry and judging, he must have been very sorely provoked. And in fact, the narrative bears that out, because in the story, God waits for 400 years before judging the Canaanites, which is a pretty good proof that saying, I'm slow to anger is not just words, it's actually something there in practice. So, another issue we can say is a lot of people are worried that, you know, it's people killing other people. Actually, in the story, God does most of the fighting. He's introduced, Joshua goes out, sees a guy with a drawn sword. He's told, this is the commander of the Lord's army. God himself is the commander of the army. Well, an atheist might say, well, yes, you know, that's all justification from within the Bible. The Bible's justifying it. Don't lots of nations say that they're better than other nations? Actually, the Old Testament is not nationalist propaganda telling you that the Israelites are better than others, because in fact the Bible claims that Israel in fact became as bad or possibly worse than the Canaanites themselves. For instance, you have how Manasseh is described as burning, one of the last kings of Judah, is described as burning his son as an offering. Used fortune-telling, omens, dealt with mediums. Or it says, Manasseh, king of Judah, has committed these abominations and done things more evil than all that the Amorites did who were before him. In other words, the Old Testament isn't telling you Canaanites are bad, Israelites are good. What it's actually telling you is that the Israelites, despite all of the privileges given them by God, became as bad as the most proverbially bad people in the Old Testament, which is a testimony to how bad human sin is. That's a key part of the story. Does the Bible encourage people to kill others today? I want to say all good readers know that they are in a completely different situation. They really do. I mean, if you're remotely awake, you should know that. So whereas the atheists like to say the Old Testament is like religious terrorism and like genocide, or that Joshua is just like what Hitler did or what Saddam Hussein did, actually I want to say no, they're very far apart. We have, you know, the specific guilt involved that's real, that it's not indiscriminate, the judgment, there's concern for children, the 400-year delay, the warrant, that's God, who's a duly authorised person, commanding it. Hitler or Saddam were not such due authorities, and God does most of the fighting. And we could list more differences. The point is, they say something's morally indistinguishable, and there are lots and lots of game-changing differences. Sometimes it can happen that two things can sound the same, and yet be worlds apart morally. Take chopping someone's leg off. Chopping someone's leg off in a massacre in Sierra Leone, or chopping someone's leg off as a surgeon on a battlefield to save that person's life. They may sound the same thing. So-and-so chopped so-and-so's leg off. And yet they're morally worlds apart. One is an absolutely terrible thing to do. The other is a sublime and noble and good deed that someone does. Do you see? Worlds apart, yet they sound the same. So what atheists have done is they said, well, God telling someone to kill someone is the same as someone thinking in their head that they can kill someone in God's name. You see what I mean? Which is actually a very different thing. I mean, it's not as if Osama bin Laden made any claim that God had boomed from a mountain commands that he should, you know, kill anyone. It's not that, you know, he can say, well, for 40 years there was a pillar of fire that appeared and authorised me. He had no authority. None. It's a completely different thing. So they say it's the same, actually it's very different. I also want to say, when people object to the Old Testament, which of two objections are they making? Are they saying it was immoral for God to command the destruction of the Canaanites? That's quite a hard thing to show, because after all, God made all things. Can't the person who gave all life take life? I would have thought so. So making a case that an all-knowing God, all-powerful God, who owned all life and gave all life, could never command the taking away of life, is a pretty hard case to make, isn't it? Do you see? But there's another objection people might be making, and that's it, say it's immoral for the Israelites to obey such a command if it really had been given. Well, put yourself in the situation of an Israelite, if it really happened. You know, that you went through the desert, you really were fed for 40 years, God really did appear in a pillar of fire and cloud, and God really did boom from the top of a mountain. Well, I would have thought that if that really happened, and if the jury thought that it really happened, that the jury would acquit you. You know, wouldn't they? I mean, did you really have a choice? I don't think so. So, I don't think either of those are good attacks on the Bible. Now, I'm not trying to say that I've answered the question, but what I'd want to say is this, I believe, is the most serious moral objection to the Bible. And yet it is not a defeater. A defeater that just shows it can't be right. You know, there are things that really just knock an argument down, knock a position down. It's not like that. So if that's the most serious objection being made to the Old Testament, and we can say it's not a conclusive objection, then that should mean that any other objections are not conclusive objections. In other words, there are no morally conclusive objections to the Old Testament. Now, if on top of that we can show that there are good grounds for believing the Bible, good grounds for accepting it, then we can say it's really reasonable to trust the Bible. We're not doing something which is foolish in an absolute sense. Of course, the world may consider it foolish, but it's not really foolish. Do you see what I mean? It's not throwing away your mind. That's what I'd like to say. So that's that first question, not dealt with, but dealt a little bit with. Next one, let's look at slavery. People say that there's a problem because the Old Testament supports slavery. This is the way Sam Harris, who's an atheist, writes. In assessing the moral wisdom of the Bible, it's useful to consider moral questions that have been solved to everyone's satisfaction. Consider the question of slavery. The entire civilized world now agrees that slavery is an abomination. What moral instruction do we get from the God of Abraham on this subject? Consult the Bible and you will discover that the creator of the universe clearly expects us to keep slaves. Now you can see a bit of slippy language there at the end. But then he does a clever thing. He quotes the Bible, and a very well-chosen passage, because he quotes Leviticus chapter 25 from the Revised Standard Version. And this is what it says. As for your male and female slaves, whom you may have, you may buy male and female slaves from among the nations that are round about you. You may also buy from among the strangers who sojourn with you, and their families that are with you, who have been born in your land, and they may be your property. You may bequeath them to your sons after you to inherit as a possession forever. You may make slaves of them, but over your brethren, the people of Israel, you shall not rule one over another with harshness. Pretty well-chosen passage, I would have thought, to make its point. Now, who reads that and finds it a difficult passage? No one. Two people. Okay. Is that all? It's a difficult passage because it talks about slaves, buying, property, possession. I mean, isn't that the Bible supporting slavery? We know slavery is wrong. Oh dear. We might put the objection this way. Bible translations talk about slaves. The Old Testament makes no objection to having slaves. The New Testament Christians are not commanded to free their slaves if they are masters with them, and slaves are in fact told to submit. Therefore, the Bible approves of slavery. We know that slavery is wrong, therefore the Bible approves of something that's wrong. Now, who feels the force of that argument? Anyone feel the force of it? I think it has some force. No one feels the force of it? Okay, some people feel the force of it. Well, for those few who feel the force of it, I'm going to deal with that, or attempt to deal with it. First thing I want to deal with is a question of translation. Now, is there anyone here tonight who uses the King James Version? You know, that wonderful old thing, ye olde version of the Bible. You know the one, King James Version, anyone use it? No? No one? Sometimes. Congratulations, sir. That's really great. Well, tonight is a good night for you. One of the things that we can say is the way Bible translations have moved in the last few years is there's been an increase in occurrences of the word slave. I mean, take the good old King James Version, that's the KJV of 1611. Only has the word slave twice, once in the Old Testament, once in the New. In the New it's clearly disapproved of. In the Old Testament it's in italics to show you it's not really there in the Hebrew, it's just a word that the translators added to make sense. New King James Version has it 46 times. The New International Version 130 times, New Revised Standard Version 166 times. Quite a few more, isn't it? The Jewish Publication Society, the Jewish version just for the Old Testament, back in 1917, only had 3 occurrences of this word. By the time they came to revise it in 1985, they had 135 occurrences. Now, go over to Germany, you look at the German translations, and you find that they've got the same word. Sklave is their masculine word, sklavin is their feminine word. Back in the Luther Bible of 1912, there were no occurrences of this word. By the time they revised it in 1984, there were 70 occurrences. You go over to Spain, or Mexico if you prefer, and you look at their translation, the Reina Valera translation. How many occurrences does it have of the word slave, masculine, or the feminine equivalent? Well, the early version of it only has 4 occurrences. By the time they revised it in 1960, 25. By the time it came to 1995, they had 65 occurrences. Does anyone notice a pattern? So the word slave is on the increase. Now, I think there are reasons for that. Probably because fewer people after the Second World War had servants, and so the words for servants tended to sound a bit archaic. People are trying to make modern translations, so they decide to use a more modern sounding term, and so the word slave comes in. But we've got to ask the question, is it the right word? we can trace how over time, from lots of early translations which have hardly any occurrences of the word slave, we now got modern translations with a ton of occurrences. Well, when we look at this Hebrew word, we actually find it's not a negative word. After all, here is someone who's rather proud to be one. This is ancient Hebrew, and it's a seal impression. It's a guy called Shema. We read right to left, by the way, just so I'm going to teach you to read ancient Hebrew. This is not the same as the normal Hebrew alphabet. This is even earlier one. It looks more like the Greek alphabet. So this is L, and that's like a S or Sh. That's a M. You can see it's a M backwards, can't you? Shema. Look, Shema. Okay, that's the guy's name, belonging to Shema. And then he says, that's a, well, it's a like, I can't do an equivalent. That's an upside down B, and that's a D, isn't it? Anyway, he is the servant, or Ebed. Ebed is the Hebrew word of Jeroboam. Now that's the word which the modern translations are translating slaves, and yet he's not, he doesn't feel like he's under the thumb. He's actually a high royal official. You see what I mean? So it's a different word because it doesn't mean someone who's under the thumb and having a really hard time. It can actually be something you'd be proud to be, like a civil servant or, something like that. So what's this word? Well, it gets translated in translations today both as servant and slave. And yet it is not an inherently negative term. In fact, it's possibly never negative in itself. It's related to work and the fact that someone is under an authority. But the point is, everyone in that society was under someone else, including the king. The king was the servant of God. So what happens is, nowadays, some of the translations, when it comes to Moses, they say Moses, the servant of God. They wouldn't want to say Moses, the slave of God, right? But at other times, they translate the word slave. So they've got the idea that there are good occurrences of the word and bad occurrences of the word. And I want to say, no, that's not what the word is about. The word is simply like this, that everyone is under someone else. There is no alternative to that. The idea that you could be like a free person is a modern myth. I mean, no one's completely free. A 2-year-old child, you hope is not free just to run out into the road. We're not free just to walk across whatever borders we like. We don't have absolute freedom. And if you decide you're going to exercise your absolute freedom and go into a casino, you may feel you're really free for a while, but then gradually that impression of freedom may well diminish. Because our choices tend to limit us in the future, don't they? You see? So this idea that, we can be completely free is a bit of a problem. But for us, the word slave is fundamentally opposed to the word free. So I want to say, actually, I'm not very happy with that word occurring in our modern Bible translation. So I'd say the problem with that is we're translating a Hebrew term that isn't necessarily that negative by a term, slave, that is irredeemably negative. Then it leads to inconsistency in translation. And this is the really hard point. It means that when we read the Old Testament and we read the word slave, instantly we're thinking about New World slavery, antebellum South. That's what we're thinking about, isn't it? Now, just a little history lesson here. At the time of the Old Testament, there wasn't that much by way of North American slavery that we know of, nothing documented. That comes later. By the time of the Old Testament, Roman society didn't really exist. So the problem is, when we hear the word slave, we think of cotton fields. We think of slave ships. We might think of Roman slavery. And then we read all of those things that happened later back onto the Old Testament, which was earlier. Now that's a problem, isn't it? Because we start thinking it's talking about that when none of that had taken place, so that the authors couldn't even be thinking in those terms. Then we have to look at what's actually going on in the Old Testament. Well, in the time of the patriarchs, what do these people do who are called this? They work as herdsmen, domestic servants. There's one case when Abraham thinks he's not going to have a child. He says, Eliezer, who's my servant, he's going to inherit everything. So these people can inherit. The children of Hagar, Bilhah and Zilpah, and I hope you know who they are, and if you don't, ask someone or read the Bible. You think they're servants, you might think they're slaves, but their children will be free and will inherit things. That's not what happens in a modern slave society, you see. Because, children of slave women, become slaves. But that's not how it was in the Old Testament. And these people are trusted. Abraham gets his most senior servant and sends him off with 10 camels and a ton of wealth to get a wife for Isaac. Well, you know, if this had been an oppressive regime, you know what the guy could have done with the 10 camels and a ton of wealth. He could have gone off. But the guy was clearly convinced that he was far better off being with his master. So it's not the sort of sense of slave and master that is meant at a later stage. Abraham trusts all of his household with weapons when they need to rescue Lot. And there's no approved selling of people by other people, no intermediaries. Of course, Joseph's brothers sell him, but that was bad when you read the story. Not a good thing. So when we compare different slave systems, we find in the Old Testament, whatever they are, they have holiday, 1 day in 7. They have to have enough food. They have legal redress. They have as much access to the city gate, which is the court, as anyone else. Can you imagine someone being taken in a slave ship from West Africa saying, I want to speak to my attorney? You know, it's not possible, is it? Because it's a different system. It's an oppressive system. They are sexually protected. There are rules about sex in the Old Testament, if you haven't noticed. Can they be kidnapped? No. Are there mentions of chains? No. Torture? No. Physical abuse, if you so much as knock a tooth out of one of your workers, they have to go free from obligation. Compare that with what went on in the Roman world, or the New World, and you're finding something completely different, you see. So, it is something very different. Or take the situation of runaways. In the Old Testament it says, you shall not give up to his master a slave, this is the English Standard Version here, who's escaped from his master to you. He shall dwell with you in your midst, in the place that he shall choose, within one of your towns, wherever it suits him. Now imagine if the Romans had run with that law. I mean, you might have seen the film Spartacus. You know, the idea, the slave rebellions, just the sheer oppression. Well, imagine if the Romans had said, if you're having a bad time with your master, just run away and we will set you up with a place to live. I mean, it wouldn't have worked. Or imagine if that had happened rather than the cotton fields. Very different, isn't it? So the Old Testament isn't talking about that sort of later slavery. In fact, if you harboured a runaway slave in the antebellum South, I can't remember which state this was, let's say South Carolina, but one of them, you know, there was a fine of $1,000. Well, think what you know, a dollar was worth back then. $1,000, pretty huge sum, and 6 months in prison. Or in the law code of Hammurabi, the ancient Babylonian king, there were rewards if you found one of those runaways. So it's quite different. The other thing is, we can read about property and ownership and sale and buying in a biblical passage, and we can read it in a naive way. I mean, if you buy a bit of computer software, you know the real small print tells you you're not actually buying it, you're just leasing it. You don't even necessarily own the physical copy. Of course, the software company's never going to come back to get that for you. They're not interested in that. They're just interested in asserting their ownership. That's what they want to do for particular purposes, well, making money. So, ownership and property and buying and selling are quite complex things. So we can read the Old Testament as if they're buying in the sense of slave market buying, when that's not what's going on. What's actually going on is what we might call debt servitude or debt slavery. You see, if you have no social welfare of any kind, and you're in a subsistence society, that means you only generate as much as you need. There's no surplus, right? In that situation, you have a bad harvest. Your animal dies. Something goes wrong. You have no food. What are you going to do? Well, someone might be kind to you. But if they're not going to be kind to you, what you can do is this. You can sell yourself, which is really selling your future work. Pledging your future work for some grain now. That's what you can do. So to say that the Old Testament shouldn't have allowed that would be basically saying, if you run out of food, you have to die. Wouldn't it? So allowing them the option of selling themselves, i.e., you know, this isn't people selling someone else on a slave market, you know, how muscly they are, look how good they look. Nothing of that kind. Rather, it's someone pledging their own future work. Of course, that was allowed within the Old Testament. Think of the alternatives. So people sell themselves, or they sell their daughters. Now, of course, you might think, well, that's a bit mean, a bit rough on the poor lass, isn't it? I mean, getting sold, I mean, how many camels can I get out of my daughter this time? Again, we're misreading this. You see, with every marriage, there was a financial transaction that went like this. The groom, the prospective groom, pays bride price. He pays the bride's father some dough, right, in order to get the bride. You think, aha, bride's father cashing in. Not at all. Because the bride's father has to pay dowry to the woman that will be used for that new family unit. If the man walks away from the marriage, he loses use of that money. If the woman walks away from the marriage, she loses the dowry. You see? So in other words, there was a system that set up financial security within a marriage. Not that the man cashed in on having a daughter at all. Rather, it was a system, a transaction like that. So we can read it as, oh, people are selling their daughters, when actually, you know, sometimes those words are translated, acquire and not quite sell, but hand over. God talked about God selling someone over to do something. It's the same sort of thing. It's not talking about cashing in a sort of commercial sense. So what we're really talking about in the case of work is temporary leasing. There aren't salesmen or intermediaries, and bodies retain rights. All of those set it completely apart from the modern slavery. Can we buy or sell people today? Well, in the Old Testament and in the New, everything ultimately is God's property. Possession's a pretty complicated thing, so we can talk about buying or selling, but let's remember that sometimes, nowadays, we talk about sports teams buying someone. No one raises an objection. Well, they might object to how much is paid. Generally the thought is people are paying too much. Not, oh no, that poor guy being bought. You see? I mean, we feel quite differently about it, don't we? So we know that, and yet when we read the Old Testament, we can easily read it in a wrong sense. So what it really means is possession of someone's work. But despite all of that, I don't think I've solved the problem. There are still bits of the Old Testament where you think, but couldn't it have gone further regulating what went on? I think it could have done. And this is where I want to say, when we're stuck with these problems, we need to go back to the beginning of the story, the creation pattern. You see, what we've got to do when we read the Old Testament, and that difficult passage from Leviticus 25, we've got to distinguish the things that God says are ideal and the things that he permits or regulates. Let me give you an example. Some governing body decides it's going to write legislation that regulates gambling. Can we say, that means the people who write the legislation approve of gambling? Well, no, they're trying to limit it, they're regulating it. They're not saying they think it's a good thing. Or they regulate prostitution, does that mean they think it's a good thing? Or regulate drugs, does that mean they think it's a good thing? No. It just means that they are deciding to put limits and not go further. Now, I think we have a clear mandate to understand some of the Old Testament as of that kind of law. And the mandate comes from Jesus. Jesus is asked about the subject of divorce. And he says, you want to understand divorce, you need to go back to the very beginning and understand in the beginning God made them male and female. And what was said about divorce was permissive. It was allowing it. Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, allowed that. And I think that applies to other things. For instance, people having multiple wives. That was regulated and allowed, but go back to the beginning, and of course, God made one man, one woman. So when we apply the same principle, we understand that the Old Testament is never telling us that having multiple wives is a good idea. Read the stories. When people have multiple wives, there are always family problems. Joseph's family wasn't the happiest example, was it? And we also, I think, can apply the same to the whole issue of servitude and slavery. I think what's going on sometimes is that God is regulating something rather than saying this is an ideal pattern. He's not writing Plato's Republic and saying this is how it should be. He's rather regulating because of the hardness of people's hearts. But then people say, hey, but what about the New Testament? Doesn't the New Testament promote slavery? Because after all, there were lots of slave masters in the New Testament, and Paul in his letters never tells them to free their slaves. In fact, he even tells the slaves to to obey their masters. Now in this case, I can't say it's Old Testament servitude, it's Roman slavery. We know Roman slavery was bad, therefore the New Testament is approving something that's bad. That's what people might say. But what we can say is, well, there's no point Paul writing about what the ideal political system would be, because his readers couldn't vote. So that would be a waste of ink, as well as a waste of someone's effort carrying the letter, which is probably more effort. What's more, if he encouraged them to rebel, well, they would be executed. Think of Spartacus, if you've seen the film. If you haven't, it's a good film to see. But the other thing is, he couldn't tell people to free all their slaves because it would have been illegal. Because there were laws by the time of the New Testament limiting how many slaves you could free. If you had 3 slaves, you could only free 2. If you had 10, you could only free 5. If you had 30, you could only free 10. You see? So if he'd said, free all your slaves, well, the people might have freed their slaves, but they would not have been free in Roman law, and therefore they would have become very vulnerable. So that would have been no use at all. So what did they do about Roman slavery in the New Testament church? Well, what did they do? Firstly, they taught that we should love others as Christ loved us. Very fundamental. If that doesn't undermine slavery, I don't know what does. Secondly, they used the language of brother and sister. That's quite a radical thing. Not calling, say, someone slave or master. They're calling each other brother and sister. There's that sort of language of equality. You might say, well, that's just nice, that's pleasant words. But they go further. They have a kissing campaign. They do. You ever heard about the holy kiss? I'm sure you do it in your church. So now people say, oh, that was part of their culture back then. It was the equivalent of a handshake. No. Sorry. How was it part of the culture back then that Jews would kiss Gentiles? How was it part of the culture back then that masters would kiss slaves? No, that was not part of the culture back then. Whom do you kiss? You kiss your family. So that's what they do. It's not just in Paul's letters, it's also in 1 Peter as well. The kiss. A practical way of indicating that we are all members of one family and breaking down all of those